Cybersecurity.
Welcome to this session of the MedTech World Digital Summit dedicated to cybersecurity. My name is Dr. Gege Gatt, and today's panel is about the dual paradoxical role that technology poses. On one side, it's an enabler, but on the other side, it's an equally plausible risk creator. Our title today is this: the more technology becomes part of the healthcare infrastructure, how are hacks to be avoided? And so, as we move from defining risk to finding proactive solutions, let me introduce you to our excellent panel today. So welcome Alan, Daniel, and Elliot. And I'll welcome you all one at a time and give some background information. So let me start with Alan Platt. So Alan is a co-founder of CyberHive, a UK-based cybersecurity firm, and he combines commercial experience with an in-depth technical background. His company co-developed a security solution with the University of Oxford. And I hope to extract from Alan today some real-world insights. And maybe, Alan, let's start with this right away. My impression is that most cyber attacks actually start as the result of human error rather than a structured system vulnerability. Is this something you've witnessed?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for the introduction. It is great to be here. And I completely agree. We see human error as one of the biggest problems in cybersecurity. The thing is, criminals don't need to go looking to develop complex hacks to bypass security systems. They're just using simple off-the-shelf toolkits to exploit simple weaknesses. All they need to do is wait, and eventually somebody will make an error, opening the door for them to get in. And attacks that start this way can actually be very, very hard to uncover. On average, it's taking companies more than 6 months to even notice that they've had a data breach.
That's an interesting insight. So thank you for that, Alan, and welcome to this panel. Next, Elliot, we're extremely lucky to have you here. Elliot is the CEO of Practical Cyber. Before that, Elliot was actually a federal cybercrime prosecutor in the US and spent most of his formative years working as a tech general counsel and entrepreneur. He co-edited the book Cybercrimes, a multidisciplinary analysis, which is an excellent reference work for practitioners, so go look for that. Most relevant to us today, Elliot's present occupation focuses specifically on the cyber risk mitigation aspect in medical devices for digital health. So welcome, Elliot. We're lucky to have you here, and let's start right away. In your experience, what are the major cybercrime risks for healthcare?
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. So healthcare is a very broad category, so I'm going to focus my comments on one part: hospital systems. Hospital systems already rely extensively on computing technologies. For example, personal computers and business applications. Networking technologies like switches, routers, servers, and wireless access points. They use cloud services like AWS and Azure. They have many third-party software as service providers integrated in their network. There's a widespread use of electronic health record software. There are medical computers wheeled around patient to patient. There are mobile charting done with medical-grade tablets. There's digital medical imaging done by sophisticated computer-based machines, MRIs, CT scans, ultrasounds. You even have computer-assisted surgery and procedures using robotics, artificial intelligence, and/or augmented and virtual reality. And there's a plethora of digital medical devices, too numerous to list. So almost every week, hospital systems today integrate new computing technologies. And they further connect their computing technologies into these large, hard-to-defend networks. Now, of course, the networking of these powerful computing technologies offers great promise for improving the delivery of healthcare services. But as you said in your opening, it also materially increases the risk that cyber attacks will harm patients by, 1, interrupting services such as a ransomware attack that shuts down an entire hospital system. 2, you could modify device operations or electronic health records that could cause a misdiagnosis or alter prescriptions, or even, the third, as Alan pointed out, steal patient data. But broadly speaking, the main reason for these heightened cybersecurity risks is what's called an increased attack surface. Attack surface means the total sum of physical and digital vulnerabilities that can be exploited to carry out a cyber attack. And the size of the attack surface for today's hospitals is enormous and growing. So in a few minutes, I will explain why this enlarged attack surface makes hospital systems so vulnerable to cybercrime.
Perfect. So I'm going to hold you to that promise, and we're certainly going to go back to the concept of the attack service. I'd also like to unpack the concept around cloud computing and how that applies to healthcare. And I know that we'll touch on this with Alan in just a minute. But let me welcome now another fellow lawyer to this panel, Daniel Torres. Daniel, it's great to have you here. Daniel has been working on IT and healthcare sectors for about 12 years now. He mainly focuses on this role that the law plays, on one hand trying to protect privacy and other rights, and on the other hand the challenge of often restricting technological development. So this dual role. So Daniel, let's kick off right away. So do you think that conventional legislation falls short in protecting us from cybercrimes, and particularly in the healthcare industry, where data is so much more sensitive and therefore a breach could have a far more complex set of ramifications?
Hi. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to share this panel with the three of you. To your question, although the law is many times seen as the last to arrive, I tend to disagree. In fact, it plays a role, even if sometimes it has to lag behind technology, but it doesn't mean that's a bad thing to happen. And several examples of the law trying to go ahead don't go quite well. And in fact, many models of thought and action were introduced by the legal field before coming to computing. And on this point, I would give you the reference of Alain Soupiot, an author, French legal author, that is really interesting on this approach.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. So let's get the session started going back to the original title. And I think going to the roots of the topic can really help us explore this interesting area in some detail. So Elliot, let's reflect on this very basic but critical question. Why is healthcare so vulnerable to cybercrime?
So again, I will focus on hospital systems. So to understand why hospital systems are so vulnerable to cybercrime, let's look at them from the perspective of cyber criminals. So consider these facts about today's cybercrime. 1, it can be very profitable. 2, the most profitable aspect is likely ransomware. Now, these are attacks that use encryption to render a business's computers useless, trying to force the victim to pay a ransom. Now, the profitability comes from the fact that so many victims are paying the ransom, which only emboldens and motivates the criminals. And if you know where to look, you can buy a ransomware software package that comes with tech support. You could try it for free and then use it to launch ransomware attacks anywhere around the world. So hospital systems are very appealing ransomware targets. Criminals know that hospitals' cybersecurity has historically been poor. They know that shutting down a hospital, even for a few hours, creates an incredible exigency and pressure. And that, as I explained earlier, hospital systems have a very large attack surface. So let's delve into that for a second. Hospitals deploy these large, sophisticated computing networks that include many third-party connected devices and applications. What this means is that to reduce their attack surface, the hospitals must diligently and intelligently implement a defense in-depth strategy that covers defensive technologies such as firewalls, intrusion detection and prevention systems, anti-malware. They must secure the many digital medical devices throughout their operations. They have to timely patch a dizzying array of software, some of which is no longer supported. They have to encrypt all data at rest and in transit. They have to perform log management of an astounding number of devices as part of an effective threat detection and analysis system. And somehow they have to rely on their overburdened, tired workforce to perform their important cyber defense role. And remember that many cyber attacks, particularly ransomware, start when an employee opens the wrong email attachment.
Right.
Now, each offensive element alone is tough enough. You have to properly customize and implement it and then continuously update it. because cyber threats continuously change and get more sophisticated. The combined challenge of all these defensive elements exacerbates the complexity, which further increases the attack surface. Hospital systems are only as secure as their weakest link, and unfortunately, many hospitals have far too many weak links.
Absolutely. So I think it's worth unpacking what you just said here and maybe bringing Alan into the discussion. If you're looking at this large attack surface, clearly an attack on a public, awfully underfunded national healthcare system could have, crippling effects, especially in sort of this pandemic period in which every element of efficiency is needed to run an organization. So if we had to point to what you said at the beginning of the panel discussion relating to cloud infrastructure, Alan, do you think that cloud infrastructure could help improve our level of defense, or is it itself an even wider surface of attack which we should be worried about?
That's actually a very good question. Let's think about this for a minute. If you think about the likes of Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Alibaba, the big cloud providers, they all bring in literally billions of dollars of revenue from cloud services. And that means that if they themselves suffered a major data breach, it could destroy them and destroy trust in their businesses. Right. That means that they can actually afford to spend vast amounts on security, and they do. So their cloud services have some of the best security monitoring in the world. And if you compare that to the kind of efforts that most companies could muster, it's simply untrue that their services are going to be less secure. They're going to be, in practice, much more secure. Problem is, it's not just about the infrastructure, it's what you do with it. Right. So imagine, for example, you were to create a database of patient data on Amazon Web Services and then leave it on there with the default username and password. It's going to be discovered and it's going to be hacked, of course. And of course, nobody would do that, would they? Well, if I say that that's exactly what happened to the Dow Jones, to Alteryx, to Experian, to Accenture, to Verizon, to name just a few companies. Also, typical cloud infrastructure might have many thousands of lines of configuration to keep it secure. And what's the chances that there are no mistakes in there? It's the human error problem again. And also, even if it was right on day one, will it still be right after 3 years of use and 3 years of modification? Thing is, the same's actually true of classic on-premise installations. And the way people think about that is that they secure them by hiding them behind firewalls and VPNs, restrict access. Thing is, they're not perfect either. Let me give you an example here. This particular one actually comes from a Las Vegas casino, but I think it's an interesting case study. They relied on a lot of on-premise infrastructure. It was all on private network, secured from the outside world by some very well-controlled firewalls. What they didn't know, though, is that as part of a recent renovation, somebody installed a really fancy fish tank for guests to look at. And it had an internet-connected controller. That controller was on the network. The attackers didn't hack the firewalls or the VPNs or the servers, they hacked a fish tank. They got access to the network through the fish tank, used it to map the network and ultimately funnel lots of valuable data out through that controller. Now, okay, not many of us have internet-connected fish tanks, but there are building management systems, IoT devices, personal laptops, mobile phones, even Wi-Fi connected light bulbs these days, and you can't control and validate them all.
Right. What an interesting point, which ties so nicely to what Elliot said earlier, that you're as good as the weakest link in the chain. And in your particular interesting story, it was the fish tank, which was the weakest link in this chain. And perhaps talking about this concept of causality and infrastructure, let's bring in Daniel here, because I'd like to overlay the legal perspective back on the main topical question that we set out to discover today. So Dan, we're talking about this idea about an attack surface, about national healthcare systems, which are often underfunded, which have huge attack surface and many weak links. I'm sure you'll agree that the EU started off quite nicely in 2008 when it started legislating to identify and protect what they called to be European critical infrastructure, which gave rise to a very important directive which we have now in place today. Should healthcare infrastructure be classified as a European critical infrastructure? Do you think we have come sufficiently along to now look at this issue not as being a national one in which states create their own internal legislation in a sovereign fashion, but something which is ultimately transborder, cross-border, which requires initiatives of a supranational level to be effective? So are we developing our legal thinking in this direction correctly, Dan?
That's a really relevant point, Gege. I believe that never, like in these pandemic days, we felt both the vulnerabilities of health infrastructure and the interdependence among member states, talking about the EU. And indeed, the disruption of these health infrastructures that no doubt that play a vital societal function could lead to a significant loss of lives and even material damages. I would say that in that sense, it would be not less than pipelines or power plants, maybe more. And so, although the health sector falls within the definition of critical infrastructure, in fact, as you said, it doesn't, in practice, is not applicable. The directive is not applicable. And so I believe if that was the way to move forward, it would allow us to make use of an already existing mechanism for cooperation, for coordination, for communication, and for the dissemination of best practices. So I think this would be a really good opportunity, in fact. Now, considering the flow of data, particularly in the health sector, it's growingly difficult to look at these issues from a national perspective. And if you are from Europe, I believe you feel it even strongly. The sharing of data, first of all, it's vital. It's vital for the owners of the data. It's vital for providing medical services. Is vital for research. And so it's pivotal for society. And so we must provide a safe environment to offer the confidence this sector needs. And so European-wide initiatives are needed. And I think this sector is one in which the EU should be ready to dig deeper, as the GDPR showed us. It's possible. It's difficult, yep. But it's possible.
Often, Daniel, states are not as well equipped to act internationally and cooperate broadly, which is why we need instruments to allow for the harmonization of principles, and protecting our critical infrastructure in healthcare is certainly a priority for European citizens.
Yeah, and it's true, and we must address this, unless we will be confronted by reality. Because if we take a step further and we think about respecting rights, particularly privacy rights, not in the context of closed systems or environments, but of big pools of data, that should be even more challenging. And certainly there are no borders there. So I think we should address this.
Agreed. A point well made, Daniel. And I'd like to now briefly move the discussion into medical devices. I think with the explosion of IoT, which of course AI enables hugely, it's interesting to look, and perhaps I'll bring Elliot into this, at the potential security risks and impacts that healthcare organizations face when introducing different digital medical devices. And let's also move the spotlight onto patient harm, right, which could actually emanate from compromised devices. So how can we mitigate these risks, Elliot?
All right, so I'm going to address the security of networked medical devices, also known as connected devices, straight on.
Right.
First, it's important to understand how connectivity of a device materially increases its attack surface. As soon as a medical device is connected in some way, either wirelessly, wired, using a persistent connection, one that's transient, one directional, bidirectional, the device becomes much easier to disrupt and the potential disruption much more severe. Literally, it means that every cyber criminal in the world might be able to access and control that connected medical device. Second, it's important to understand that connected medical devices are, like every other computing technology, endemically vulnerable. They use firmware, operating systems, and other software, all that have bugs or might have bugs that allow attackers to find and exploit vulnerabilities.
Right.
Now, third, as I've seen in my cybersecurity practice, practices, many device manufacturers in their rush to commercialization fail to properly secure their devices. So common mistakes include having insufficient cybersecurity knowledge and talent during all phases of device design and commercialization, failing to use secure coding practices when creating proprietary software, failing to properly address the vulnerabilities of hardware components and third-party software during purchasing, and then integration. And finally, another common mistake is failing to have an effective post-market system to identify and remediate new vulnerabilities in devices. So the current policies, procedures, and controls to secure connected medical devices are actually well known to cybersecurity experts. There's no magic about medical device computing technologies, but many device manufacturers just don't deploy these right procedures because either they don't appreciate the size of the risks or they just don't understand how to cost effectively secure their devices. So in my experience, the main solution is to get the device manufacturers to define and deploy the right cybersecurity expert during the full device lifecycle. But it's particularly important during the design phase. That's where the manufacturer with the right experts can create a cradle-to-grave system that cost-effectively mitigates device cyber risks, and it is the patients who are the ultimate winners here, because these devices, and the more they're integrated into the human body and the more they affect our lives, the bigger the risk.
It's interesting to see the American campaign at the minute actually touching on transhumanism in some areas, so the introduction of medical devices in the human body, which really come back to your point, which is the criticality of care from cradle to grave, and understanding that a continuous improvement cycle within that is absolutely critical. And that is where the law underpins the framework of behavior in the industry. And it's great that we talk about devices, and I'm going to move you all to start wrapping up now, but telegraphically I'd just like to move to Alan and really frame this within the context of COVID and all of us working from home, as I can see from your lovely colorful backgrounds. So we're all in this moment where we're using connected devices which may be less secure, be they email or other remote work devices. Alan, are these potential sources of data leaks within the context of the healthcare environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So we all rely on email, file sharing, etc., to share very sensitive information. And there's a UK official was recently quoted as saying that they're 95% sure that Russian hackers have attempted to steal coronavirus vaccine from the University of Oxford. And that research is a huge deal. And pharmaceutical development costs a fortune. It typically takes years for a drug to reach the market. And I saw some information from Johns Hopkins Uni that they estimate it takes between $2 and $3 billion to develop a new pharmaceutical. Yeah. And of course, it's not just pharma, it's also medical devices, diagnostic equipment that are being developed. Of course, they might be patented, but in the early stages of research, they rely on keeping the IP secret from copy makers. One really big problem is this problem of moving to home. It's given IT teams some real headaches. Yeah. Security setups are really designed to secure people in the office, and moving people so that they can work from home has actually required those IT teams to basically tunnel underneath their carefully fortified castle walls, opening up huge security weaknesses. And again, it's been done at speed, so it's prone to human error. I think the best thing to do here is to actually look at how other sectors are solving this problem of data security is a really good place to start. So at my company, CyberHive, we actually recently built an email and file sharing platform for parts of the UK government. Essentially, they wanted to use Office 365, standard Microsoft tech, because it's accessible from anywhere in the world, it's easy to administer, it's well known. Interestingly, they're also exactly the biggest weaknesses, that they couldn't rely on it, even with top-of-the-line Microsoft security in place. One human error from a system administrator will be all it took to leave national security data wide open. So we built this solution, we call it Gatekeeper, and it's a platform that sits between the end user and a heavily locked down version, and it's all secured by our patented trusted cloud tech. But importantly, it provides protection against system administrator mistakes and human error, as well as providing full audit tracking. Right. And actually, this is the first time the government have been able to use cloud for information at this level of sensitivity. And we love it. It's dead easy to use. So I'd love to try to get that exact same technology out into the medical and the MedTech industry to provide the same kind of degrees of protection.
Right. And with this final thought about simplicity yet security, let's end this panel here. Obviously, 20 minutes are not enough to do justice to this subject. However, I hope that from this brief conversation that we've managed to stimulate, we created some more ideas to improve cybersecurity in healthcare organizations, and this idea that they need to hire informatics professionals, not simply to collect and manage or leverage data, but to protect it as well. I hope we managed to raise some awareness and outline the medical role cybersecurity has to play in healthcare. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you panelists Daniel, Elliot and Alan for being so brilliant.